So we're here in Hopkinsville, Kentucky on the Tennessee-Kentucky state line. I wanted to tell you the story of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. He's buried right here, and also trace a little bit of genealogy. His father's buried on the opposite side of the cemetery, and Edgar Cayce had a bit of a tough childhood, not as tough as some in this part of Kentucky, but still rife with family tragedy. So Edgar Cayce is buried a little distance away in this cemetery. His father is right here in the Cayce family plot. His name was Leslie Burr. He was born in 1853. Now he and his wife, Carrie Cayce, had one daughter before Edgar was born. However, very sadly, she died only 11 months old. Her name was Leila Cayce. So Edgar Cayce was the only boy of the couple as the rest of the daughters grew to old age. The next sister to be born to Father Leslie Cayce and his wife Carrie was Sister Annie Cayce, who lived to be 78 years old, only dying in 1957, and very oddly she never married, something almost unheard of in a rural Kentucky place like this, and undoubtedly she was a very influential person in her brother Edgar's life. So Edgar Cayce was the eldest surviving child of Leslie and Carrie Cayce, his older sister having died before he was born. Her name was Leila, and he grew up alongside his slightly younger sister, Annie Cayce. He also grew up with Sarah, Ola, and Mary Cayce, three more sisters. So now he's got an absent father, or a semi-absent father, a working man who's always out on the farm or in town, Leslie Cayce, and he's growing up surrounded by his four sisters and his mother. Edgar Cayce very briefly also had a younger brother named Thomas, but when Edgar was only 10 years old, the child, who lived less than 2 weeks, passed away and was buried here in the Cayce family plot, right next to his sister, Layla. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that Edgar Cayce was a very young child growing up in a rural Hopkinsville farm, surrounded by sisters, one of whom at least was very independent, a hardworking mother, and a father who was almost always absent and only came back to teach him some school lessons that he didn't really take too strongly to, and this was something that often resulted in fights between him and his father. Like many people in the late 1800s in the local area, the Cayces moved from their home in a rural farmstead into the town of Hopkinsville to their new home at 705 West 7th Street, and this area is now a bank. Then in 1897, he got engaged to a beautiful young woman named Gertrude, a woman who would stick with him for the rest of his life and actually die almost right after him in 1945. She's buried right next to him in the local graveyard.
It's strange how they put so much stuff on there.
Crystals, good luck charms.
What is the Kinder Mini?
And isn't that beautiful? Edgar Cayce died January 3rd, 1945, and his wife passed away on April 1st, not too long after. And the Cayce couple had a few children, two of whom are buried at Virginia Beach. That would be Edgar Evans Cayce, who only died in 2013, and Hugh Lynn Cayce, who died in 1982. But their son, Milton Porter Cayce, sadly only lived from March to May 1911. After his engagement with Gertrude, Edgar Cayce took up a job with a locally renowned photographer named W.R. Bowles. I believe this is his family plot, but he doesn't have an individually marked grave. He was one of the most well-known photographers in Kentucky, and his photos appeared in newspapers around the country. His office was at 22 North 9th Street in Hopkinsville. By all accounts, Edgar Cayce was a good worker with a reliable work ethic, but supplemented his apprenticeship by working as a salesman. And then for some reason in 1900, he lost the ability to speak above a whisper. This forced him to work almost solely in photography, so throughout the year, he would only be able to speak when hypnotized. And then in early 1901, he had willed his voice back. Now, the story about this is pretty interesting. See, he met an early traveling hypnotist who went by the moniker the Laugh Man at the Hopkinsville Opera House, and this man privately hypnotized him and he found that this temporarily cured him, reaffirming he was talented, but usually only talented when he was asleep or in a form of a trance. He struggled with this and tried to find the spiritual implications, and it was during these hypnosis sessions that he first experienced the occult. So Dr. A.C. Lane suggested to the Laugh Man and Cayce when they were behind the stage that perhaps Cayce could describe his own cure. And this is something he did, but it also marked the start of him beginning his sessions with saying, "We have the body." Basically, he was describing what he called an entity taking control of him and diagnosing him from basically a different plane of existence. And this time, the entity said the cure was to increase blood to his voice box, which it did through vascular dilation. Before Cayce woke up, Lane said he could increase it to his face, which he did, and his face became blood red. He then did the same for his chest, which was flush. After 20 minutes, he woke up, and his voice was healed. Dr. Lane had an office at the corner of 9th and Main Street in Hopkinsville, and with his voice back and a good pitch and experience in the occult, Cayce began to work with Lane. Lane himself moonlit as what was called an electromagnetic healer, and used Cayce to diagnose patients remotely while he was in a trance. Cayce didn't realize he was even doing anything spiritual and claimed it was just a job, that he and his family were churchgoers, and that any prophecies he had were only to glorify God himself. An article from 1904, from when he was still in western Kentucky, shows that Edgar refused to charge for any readings. Lane would hypnotize him, he would diagnose. Before too long, Lane's clinic was shut down by the state medical authorities, and Edgar Cayce began to roam around the country, eventually opening a photography studio that burned down twice. Cayce was soon recognized by the papers as an illiterate farmer who became a doctor when under hypnosis. The papers called it medical clairvoyance. After suffering from life difficulties and bankruptcy, he moved to Selma, Alabama in 1912 after the death of his child, where he'd live until 1923. He worked in photography as a clairvoyant on the side. Written accounts of Edgar Cayce begin to get a bit spotty around this time, and in 1915, it was reported that he regained his voice after 3 months of silence, so it seems like these silent periods were recurring for him. He never profited from his work and did it to praise God. He rambled for many years, founding libraries and research institutes. In 1942, a book was published, There Is a River, which claimed that Edgar would play with the little folk and his dead grandfather, but knew that they were incorporeal because he could see through them if he looked hard enough. This book relates that Cayce learned to read the Bible at age 10 and found an old cabin in the woods where he'd do this again and again, reading it over a dozen times in solitude. Eventually, a woman appeared to him and told him his prayers were answered, asking him what he wanted more than anything. He asked to be a missionary or to help people. The next night, his dad yelled at him because his spelling was terrible, and after quizzing him, he knocked young Edgar from his chair. That night, the angel appeared again and told him to sleep on his book and that they could help him learn by diffusion. When his dad found him sleeping on his spelling book, he grilled him again and began to ask him some questions about spelling. Edgar knew all the answers, which made his dad mad, thinking he was pretending earlier, so again he knocked his son down to the floor. It seems like the boy probably had a deep relationship with his sisters and his mother. By the early 1890s, his father was proud of his psychic son and bragged to everyone in town about him. He earned the name the Sleeping Prophet at a baseball game. Someone hit him at the base of the spine with a pitch, and he acted strangely, possibly from nerve damage, when asleep, and spoke the cure out loud. It worked. And he had a long life at Virginia Beach and rambling around the country in Selma, but I just kind of wanted to take you here to Hopkinsville and show you where he was born and where the Cayce clan sort of originates.
Yeah, like you know that